Hi, I'm Reggie Harris, and I'm running for Cincinnati City Council in 2021. Hey Mark, how are you?
I'm good. How are you today, Reggie?
I'm doing really well. Super happy to have you on our podcast, We Will, the Reggie for Cincinnati podcast. So, Mark, as I was explaining to you before we started chatting and recording, this podcast, we're doing a 3-part affordable housing series. And part 1, we chatted with Sarah Thomas, our friend from NEST, the executive director of NEST, Northsiders Engaged in Sustainable Transformation. And we chatted with Sarah about the importance of the city having a comprehensive plan, a comprehensive housing strategy that talks about affordable housing and, commercial developments and, market rate housing, and how an overall comprehensive plan is inextricably linked to one another. And so we can't really have a very cohesive affordable housing strategy or plan without thinking about overall city development. And part 2, we talked with our friend Ozzie Davis about home ownership and just how home ownership actually brings lots of stabilities to communities and families. And with you, Mark, I really want to talk about you have such a broad area of expertise, and we've been chatting about lots of things related to transportation and housing for years. And I wanted to chat with you about some just basic things that council members and the mayor can do to begin to open up our housing market, to prime us for more developments and to increase our housing supply. And these are things that are just like very much within our jurisdiction for doing. So we will jump right in. So, Mark, I know you, but for viewers that may not know you, will you introduce yourself and tell us a bit about you and your background and what you do?
Yeah, thanks, Reggie. So I'm Mark Samaan. I'm a Cincinnati resident and native. I have a master's degree in community planning from UC in DAP school, and I have worked as a planner in a variety of jurisdictions, and currently as transit planner for Metro. But in the past, I worked with municipalities on zoning and variances and long-term planning goals and all of that. So when it comes to zoning, I think the most important thing to remember is that is almost entirely a function of local government. So city councils set the zoning code and the zoning map of which properties are in what area, and then what you can do in those specific zones. So that ranges from like a single family zone where you can only build one housing unit on each lot, and it goes to like high density residential where you can build large apartment buildings, and things like industrial in between, commercial, and mixed use stuff. So almost all of that is set by your local government. So it's really a reflection of how the local government wants the city to grow over time. Because growth comes from economic pressures, or from more people moving in, or more industry jobs being created, or new resources, or what have you. Growth is driven by a lot of different external factors, but cities guide that growth. They, where do you want the larger buildings to be built versus the smaller buildings? Where are you even allowed to build new job centers or, housing units? So it's, really guiding where that growth happens.
Well, Mark, and in your comments, you said, I resonated with your comments around growth and thinking about how cities grow. And so I'm a transplant to Cincinnati. My husband and I moved here 6.5 years ago. It'll be 7 this summer, 7 years here. And, when I think about all that Cincinnati has to offer as a city, I mean, I jokingly say all the time that, like, I think that as a city, we do ourselves a disservice because when we talk about ourselves, often it's about, like, not really great sports teams and the chili. When in fact, it's like a city that has like one of the most beautiful housing stocks in the country, a city that has like an incredible landscape and all of these like hidden gems of like these views. You drive in a neighborhood, you make two wrong left turns and you're on like an overlook and you can just see like this gorgeous cityscape in the Ohio River, with like world-class art institutions. And so when we think about growth, and I think that also when we think about growth in the context of global warming and seeing how we are positioned in the country where we're not prone to major floods or earthquakes or hurricanes. And as we think about those realities, like we just are kind of landlocked in a way that's is a protective factor, that we are a city that is poised for growth. And so we need to be thinking very proactively about how do we grow equitably? How do we avoid the headaches of like Nashville and the headaches of like Austin and Denver, all of these cities that like had this boom of growth, but didn't have the infrastructure to accommodate the growth, and also had a lot of displacement. And so we have the tools. We absolutely have the tools in this city to plan for growth and to do really cool and innovative things. So that piece about growth really resonated with me.
Yeah, and I think, Cincinnati since 1950 till 2010 was a shrinking city. Every year they lost tens of thousands, or every decade they lost tens of thousands of residents. So, in 1950 we had about 500,000 people that lived in the city of Cincinnati limits. And today it's more like just over 300,000. So that was like a linear drop, for all of those years. So we weren't really experiencing growth when it came to housing and residences. The city was growing as a job center with downtown and the hospitals and the universities growing. So there was still a ton of people commuting in and out of the city and sort of adding to the tax base. But in terms of residences, when you lose 200,000 people, you're going to lose a lot of housing units too over time, just because if there's more people, or if there are more, empty housing units than there are households to fill them, then they're vacant. Over time, they crumble, get demolished, or are eventually rehabbed when the demand increases again. But now we're growing. We're in a growth cycle. So we have people moving in to the city of Cincinnati, into places that were not necessarily vacant, but had lost a lot of population over the decades, and bringing back more demand for housing in the city. And that's new. That's a new problem that we haven't faced since pre-World War II. So, you lose 200,000 people, you lose a lot of households, a lot of housing units. So when you start to grow again, you're not necessarily keeping up with the housing demand, because in this case, a lot of our city is zoned for lower density residential development patterns. Bigger yard, bigger lot, one unit on each lot, which takes up a lot of land, and so there's fewer, less density over the entirety of the city. So when you're in a growth phase like we are now, that causes housing prices to rise, because there's suddenly more people looking for housing, and the people who are looking for housing generally have a higher income. There are more higher income people looking for rental units in the city of Cincinnati. So it drives up costs when, if the city is zoned to shrink, then when you grow, you get costs go up.
I just want to highlight something you said, Mark, that I think is so great. When the city is zoned to shrink, and I think an important thing for us to think about and to hold up. That was powerful there, and that's absolutely right. And I hear you describing of what is known as sort of simple supply and demand, and and how a city like Cincinnati, we're zoned to shrink, but we have a growth leadership. We have so we want to grow.
Shrinking. Yep, we're not.
And we're not shrinking.
So, and to put it just like in the most simple terms, like if you have a neighborhood and there's 500 houses and you can only build one house per lot, then the max amount of households there will ever be is 500. So if 600 people want to live there, then the 100 people who can pay the least don't get to live there, unless there are protections, right? And, unless you have, and in the real world there are low-income housing vouchers, there's public housing, there are subsidized but privately run, buildings. And there are just some landlords who choose to keep their properties affordable for one reason or another. But without those kinds of protections and without building more supply in general, those start to go away. So eventually you just end up with a system where you get, people can't find housing, and so people start crowding into, you might have two families living in one unit. You might have, to split the cost. Or people have to leave and find housing somewhere else where there is housing being built and there is enough supply.
Yeah, absolutely. Mark, and so we've, identified and said, okay, so we can reform our zoning policies, reform what is being labeled as exclusionary zoning, right, to create the conditions for more supply. But there are other things that we can do that I think that go along with that is this idea of eliminating parking? Is it parking minimums, right? This idea of when there is a development, not requiring that the developer build a parking lot or develop a empty lot to house cars. Rather, that space can be used for additional units, which also creates more opportunity for affordable units. And this piece really resonates with me because, Mark, I grew up in Chicago, on the south side of Chicago. I started taking the bus to school in third grade. I lived in New York, obviously took public transportation. My husband and I lived in Boston for 4 years, and oddly, we had a car. It was a weird situation, but we were lucky enough in Boston to find a garage. Don't ask us how. But we drove our car once every 6 months living in Boston. And when we drove our car, it's because we went to IKEA or to visit his parents who are 45 minutes away. But other than that, it was so inconvenient to drive. And it's really convenient to drive in Cincinnati. I think that even with the growing, and I've heard people complain about parking in OTR, but compared to cities like Chicago and Boston, OTR, even on a Saturday night, is still not hard to find parking because you can. And so part of, I think, creating this demand for public transportation is that we have to make it more inconvenient to drive.
Yeah, and you could look at it like that. When it's more inconvenient to drive, people will seek other options if those options are there and convenient, right? So,
yes.
As public transit options grow and as more infrastructure, non-car infrastructure is built, better pedestrian connections and bike infrastructure and whatnot, you start taking a lot of the local traffic off the road. I lived in Boston, too, for 4 years, and most of your everyday trips were accomplishable by foot or by the T, the subway or a bus, right? Because there was such a high density of residential units that everything you could need was within walking distance, except for a few items or very specific things, or maybe your job was in another neighborhood, so you're commuting. But like everything else, shopping and leisure and visiting people and going out and going to the corner store, like that's all accomplishable on foot in a dense urban environment. And dense not meaning, I don't know what part of Boston you lived in, but I lived in Somerville, and Somerville is...
I was in Cambridge.
Yeah, so Somerville is mostly like 3-story buildings that are like houses, and each floor is...
Yeah, those really ugly with the sidings. I thought that they were ugly.
They got that New England, that New England cottage. Yeah, here we do a lot more with brick.
It's terrible.
Yeah. Yeah. But, you know, those are 3 units in one house on a regular sized lot. So, you know, on an average block where I lived, you know, if you were to count in this neighborhood of 3-story houses with a unit on each, if you count each house on each side of the street, and you know there are 3 units in each, there were some streets I would count that weren't very, very long blocks, but there were about 100 units on this street. And there was no big apartment building, right? Like it wasn't like towers, and it wasn't like a big kind of fenced off campus-esque apartment building. It was just houses. But because they could fit multiple units on one lot, what kind of visibly looked like a regular residential neighborhood street actually had well over 100 people living on it. And multiple people.
Yes.
So even 200 people, right? And that's one block. So,
yeah,
you know, when Cincinnati was shrinking and it lost those 200,000 people, a big chunk of that loss was from the downtown West End urban renewal era. But most of it was just outer neighborhoods or inner neighborhoods that weren't downtown emptying out. So people leaving the house on the street, and then it would be vacant forever, or replaced with like a rental, maybe a long-term renter or a short-term renter, whatever. Housing, cheaper housing because there's less demand. But when you lose all of those units, or you specifically lose like folks who, what's the word I'm looking for? Who want to be local, and you know, you have the ability to walk places, so you actually do walk places. You know, when you have that dense housing, you get those neighborhood stores and amenities that don't need parking, and that...
Well, that's exactly right. Yes. And you know, you touched on something that I wanted to discuss further, and this idea of like when we talk about neighborhood growth and we talk about affordable housing. You know, I work for a nonprofit affordable housing developer. You know, we have a sort of ethos that we are guided by, and so we do affordable housing projects, but we're really focused on mixed income communities because, you know, you need that diversity of socioeconomic statuses to, you know, attract those amenities. And so one of the things that I've been thinking about as we're having this conversation, you know, in the city, so in the county, we have this 40,000 unit shortage, in the city, 28,000 units, you know, roughly. And I just hear a lot of folks, rightfully so and passionately so, just saying we need to build affordable units, but the housing needs to be built in communities that have amenities, right? And so, you know, if you just, you know, flood a particular area with, you know, housing that's, you know, serving people who are at 30%, 50 to 30% AMI or lower, you know, folks there are hardworking and they're doing the things, but that just from, you know, socioeconomic, I mean, from an economic perspective, does not bring in the capital to be able to sustain needed amenities for people to walk to. So, you know, we have to do both. You have to have affordable units, and you have to have market rate units, and you have some luxury units. You have to, like, a plan to do all of those things. And I just think over the past decades, you know, folks have not seen that plan. We see money for stadiums. We see money for luxury development projects, but we don't see a plan for affordable. But I've been saying this to a lot of folks, and I'm wondering, what you would say is that we have the room to do it all in Cincinnati. Like, it doesn't have to be a binary. We don't have to do one or the other. That I think that we have the room to do it all, but we have to actually do the things we need to do to create the circumstances to build affordable housing.
Right, and if you think of the affordable housing projects that have been built recently in Cincinnati, they tend to be like of a certain size and of a certain amount of units, like above 50 units, or it's like you build 100 units and a certain percentage of them are under 60% AMI or something. But if you can contrast that to most of our existing affordable housing stock, like not public housing, but just rental units that are cheap without having subsidy, without being like very nice and renovated, just the landlord has lower than market rents. Almost all of those existing units are in not big buildings. They're in duplexes, or they're in those 4-unit boxes with the stairs in the middle.
Yeah.
Each side. That's like classic Cincinnati housing. And, a lot of people who grew up in the city remember growing up in one of those, or living in a neighborhood that had those peppered about. And those are those kind of affordable units that already exist. And due to the way our zoning is, a lot of them are in a zone that now doesn't allow them to be built. So, a lot, like I live on Georgia Avenue in Northside. I can sit outside on my, I can sit and look outside, and I see a couple of those quadplex 4-unit boxes with some single family homes peppered in between. But that area is zoned single family. So what that means is that none of those buildings with more than one unit in them, none of them could be built today. They can stay because they exist. They can't retroactively ban a land use, but they can't be expanded. If there's a unit vacant for more than a year, or the building is vacant for more than a year, it has to revert to a single family home. And over time, people tend to buy the cheaper ones that are more run down, demolish them, and then put up a nice, more expensive single family home, because that's what you can build. And so we lose those units over time, and we're not replacing near as many as we're losing. But a lot of the units that we're replacing them with are in larger apartment buildings concentrated in certain areas. Specifically, like there's been a lot of growth in Uptown, Downtown, Avondale, in Walnut Hills, where you're seeing a lot of like multi-hundred unit buildings being built, either all market rate or some lower end units in them. But we're losing the actual houses, right?
Right.
2 or 3 or 4 unit buildings that are smaller and spread out everywhere in every neighborhood. And
yeah, that makes so much sense.
It might surprise you that the neighborhoods that have the most amount of that kind of housing, the 2 and 3 and 4 unit housing, are East and West Price Hill, and then Hyde Park and Oakley. So those neighborhoods have huge amounts of housing stock that is 2 or 3 or 4 unit, and that are currently in single family zones.
Wow.
And every neighborhood has a decent amount of those kinds of units. So those are already spread out citywide, but they can't be built today. So if they all disappeared, they would be replaced with single family homes, or nothing.
Absolutely. So listen, Mark, I mean, you and I, we can chat about this for hours, but we're going to wrap up. And before we go, I want to play a little game. So we've been doing this, and I give a shout out to the Las Culturistas podcast, and they do a segment like this, and so I've tweaked it a little bit, but we're going to do a 1-minute rant on what bothers you, and it could be whatever you want, as serious or as light as it is. And so, Mark, if you pull out your phone, I'm going to go first, and you're going to time me. And I'm going to start the phrase with what bothers me, and then I'm going to try to pepper in what bothers me as many times as possible during my rant. You're going to give me a 30 seconds heads up, a 15 seconds heads up, and a 5-second heads up. And then I'll have to be done. So you let me know, and then I'll start my rant.
All right. 3, 2, 1.
So you know what bothers me, Mark? What bothers me so much is when folks do not know how to do a zipper merge on the highway. Mark, it bothers me so much, it drives me crazy. So the issue with folks and with the zipper merge is that you have to drive to the very end of the entrance. So you zip something from the bottom up. You often don't zip things from the top down, and so you have these drivers who get on the on-ramp and then they actually break the rules. They cross the solid white lines and merge, and then the whole ramp is backed up. That is not how you zipper merge. You go all the way to the end. Go all the way to the end of the dashed lines, and then you merge over. It bothers me that they create fake traffic, and that is not how you zipper merge. All right. Well, I love that you did. You kind of held up the sign. Awesome. Okay. So I'm going to open my app for you, and I'm going to give you a count in, and so you get to do what bothers me. Okay. In 3, 2, 1, go.
You know what bothers me? What bothers me is growing up in Cincinnati, going to Catholic school, learning from all of these folks that I grew up with and their parents that there are parts of towns that are simply, not good to go to, that are ghetto, that are filled with undesirable people, things that you learn. And what bothers me about that is that when I grew up and I went to these places, I realized that what they meant was that there are black people here. And that was mind-blowing to me.
30 seconds.
Turns out that when you're driving down the street in a neighborhood and you see a bunch of people who are black, white, mixed, whatever, turns out that to some in our society, if there's a certain number of those people who
15
are
seconds.
black over a certain amount, this is a bad neighborhood. That blew my mind because I was raised in that. A lot of people I know were raised in that.
5 seconds.
Attitudes stick around to today. Not bad neighborhoods, just different people.
Wow. Ooh, I like that one. Ooh, good, Mark.
Thinking about that. Yeah.
Wow. Well, listen, it's always a pleasure. Thank you so much. And I just, continue to look forward to what you will do to help shape our cities. I appreciate your time, Mark.
Thanks for having me.